Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video, and today we're going to be looking at the 2022 Senate elections and which party I think is going to win the Senate after the 2022 midterm elections. So, for a little background, the Democratic Party currently holds 36 Senate seats, the Republicans hold 30, or by the time that the election comes around, they'll hold 36 and 30 respectively. Right now, the makeup is split at 50-50, but the Democrats do technically have the majority, as Kamala Harris, the vice president, is the tiebreaker. So we're going to get started and take a look at our safe Democratic states. These would be Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New York, the home of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Connecticut, and Vermont. Phil Scott did say he would not run for Senate, so kind of dashing the hopes of this race being even competitive. And even if Scott ran, it probably would have only been likely Democrat at best for the GOP. And he actually said he might even vote for Patrick Leahy should he run for re-election. So uh, the Democratic Party going to win the seat no matter what happens. So yeah, now for the Republican Party, they have seats that they're going to win no matter what. Idaho, Utah, the Dakotas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Kansas again is a state where the suburbs are swinging the state to the left, but you have a popular incumbent Republican, and the Democrats aren't really going to try to win this race. So I think that Jerry Moran should be fine. Arkansas, Missouri, even if the GOP runs Eric Gretton's, they will be absolutely fine. The state's red enough for them to run a bad candidate, and they'll still probably win by at least 10. So yeah, Iowa is Chuck Grassley, likely running for I think a ninth term. He very popular there. He'll win re-election by a safe margin. Excuse me. Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Alabama, as well as South Carolina. These are safe states for each party. So that puts the Republican Party at 44 seats. They're going to win no matter what. The Democrats have 45 of those seats. So now we're going to get into the more interesting races. So the Democrats, as of right now, I think they only have one likely seat, and it's Colorado, putting them up to 46 seats. And I think Colorado's a state that Biden did win by a safe margin, but with him being the incumbent president during a midterm, the state could trend a little bit to the right. Not saying that there's a long-term trend going on there, but that I wouldn't count on the Democrats winning by kind of the margin that they won by here in 2020. And it's more realistic for them to expect to win by around 10 to 12. So yeah, that's it for our likely D states. For the likely Republican states, we have Alaska, where this is a state that Biden did lose only by a likely margin. He made major inroads here for a Democrat. He basically had the best Democratic performance in a couple of decades in the state of Alaska, and it is trending to the left. But with that being said, it's not going to flip anytime soon at the Senate level or at the presidential level. So yeah, and we also have to remember that Alaska, we have an interesting situation going on here. We have Lisa Murkowski, a very moderate incumbent Republican, being primaried by a more right-wing challenger. So whoever wins that primary, I'd expect to be the favorite in the race against whoever the Democrats run, whether that be Al Gross or Elise Galvin, who have both expressed interest. I'd still think that whoever wins would probably win by a likely margin. Now, we could see kind of repeat of 2010 where a more right-wing Republican beats Murkowski out in the primary, and Murkowski runs as an independent or as a write-in candidate, which she did win, and she ran as a write-in in 2010 and won. So it's not crazy to think that she'd do it again, especially with ranked choice voting, proving that there would really be no spoiler effect for anyone in that race. So really hard race to dissect as of right now, but I think that likely Republican is the best rating for it at the moment. Florida, as of right now, I'd say Florida is a likely Republican. Marco Rubio is a pretty strong incumbent. I think he's weaker than people think. But with Stephanie Murphy announcing that she's not going to run for Senate anymore, now that Val Demings is probably going to be the Democratic nominee, the seat only got safer. I think if it was a Rubio versus Murphy matchup, we could expect Rubio to win by maybe 5. But with Demings, I think Demings is weaker. She's still a decent candidate, but she's still weaker than Murphy, who is an exceptional candidate. So I think that, with that being said, it's still a race that the Republicans are going to win by a likely margin. I bet on Rubio winning by similar margin to 2016, maybe in between 7 to 8% going on there. So yeah, and then Ohio is another state where the Republicans, there's a very small chance the Democrats pull it off. They have a decent candidate there, Tim Ryan, who has appealed to a lot of Trump voters. In his district, he ran ahead of Joe Biden, but this is still a state that is pretty red, and that I would expect at this point to go to the GOP by in between 5 and 7%. So yeah. Now with that being said, we're going to move on to our lean D states. These are the really interesting ones. So we have kind of the we're left kind of with for the Democrats. Their seats are kind of the core four Democratic incumbents. We have Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, Mark Kelly in Arizona, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, and Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire. And these are all incumbents that either won in 2020 or 2016, and they won by pretty thin margins. The biggest margin that we saw was with Catherine Cortez Masto, I believe, in Arizona. She won by 2.4%. We saw a similar thing with Kelly. He won by 2.4. Warnock won Georgia by 2. In New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan won by under a point. It was very close. She only won by a couple thousand votes in New Hampshire. So, yeah. Now, I think that if the Republicans just ran mediocre candidates, all these races would be lean D. But we could see the Republicans run bad candidates in some races and really good candidates in other races. So we're going to go through these races state by state. I think Nevada and Arizona are actually both lean D states. I think Nevada, the Republicans, I think, the only candidate that's really declared for them is Adam Laxalt, and Brian Sandoval, the former popular governor, declined to run. So, Adam Laxalt is likely going to be the GOP nominee. He's not a terrible candidate. He's very decent. He's decent. He's not really a scandal play candidate or anything like that, but he did lose the governor's race in 2018 by around 4 to 5, by I think 4 or 5%. And I just don't see him winning after coming off that defeat, even if it is a little close this time around. In Arizona, we have Mark Kelly, the incumbent Democrat, facing off against whoever the GOP runs. My guess is that they're gonna actually not run Mark Brnovich. I think Brnovich is called the favorite in the primary right now, but he is still a pretty moderate Republican who did not really try to mess with the election results of his state. And I think that Trump has already in his memo started to call Brnovich out. So I think that we could see Brnovich. He's his favorite right now, but really, I think he'd lose the primary because he doesn't really have the backing of the Trump base that dominates the Republican Party at this point. So I think that even if it is Brnovich, he doesn't get the base support, and if they run someone else like a Trumpy candidate, we see a similar thing where they lose the state of Arizona because of how they can't appeal to moderates in the Phoenix suburbs that turn the state against Trump. And we could also see Kelly improving with Hispanics without Trump on the ballot. So I think Kelly could win by around a similar margin to what we saw in 2020. I think he wins by a little more at this point in time, but it's totally up in the air for how much he wins by right now, but he is favored. So that's it for our lean D states. We have one more. Pennsylvania. This is the first Democratic pickup. I forgot to mention this. We have a crowded Democratic primary. We have John Fetterman, we have Malcolm Kenyatta, we have Connor Lamb, and potentially Madeline Dean, although I don't think Dean's going to run. So, Kenyatta versus Fetterman is a really interesting matchup because Fetterman is kind of a more progressive populist type candidate, whereas Kenyatta is, the definition of a Pennsylvania Democrat. He's a younger Democrat from Philadelphia. So I think that he can really run it up in Philly in that primary, and then Fetterman could do well in the more working class areas of the state, more kind of around Pittsburgh. So it's an interesting thing to watch, but I think that no matter who the Democrats run, even if it is Kenyatta, who I think is their weakest candidate, I'm still betting on the Democratic Party winning here, especially with the Republican Party being so divided. I mean, like, whether they run Ryan Costello, who are a moderate Philly suburban candidate, or a populist Republican like Sean Parnell, I still don't think that they're favored here, and especially in a state that Biden won when they're so divided in the primary. So moving on to our leading Republican states, I think that we only at this point in time have one, which is the state of New Hampshire. Sununu, I don't know. I was, if you'd asked me back in January or February, I would have definitely said that Sununu was favored to win. It's favored to run. He'd probably win by 5 or more percent. But I think some of these polls have been getting a little closer. Sununu said he is not going to make a decision until next month, with I think June or July. We're going to see him state whether he's going to run for Senate or not. So we're not sure what's going on here. I do think that if he did run, he'd be favored, but not by like the 5-point margin that I would have expected a couple of months ago. More, I think if he did run, it would be more of a toss-up that leans Republican. He'd win by 2 or 3 at this point in time. So yeah, Sununu, but I still think he's going to run. Don't get me wrong, and I still think that he'd beat Hassan, especially in a year where we have Democrats trying to flip seats in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and defend seats in Georgia and Arizona. So again, I do think that Hassan would have a chance here, but she wouldn't be favored at this point in time. Now, we have our tilt states set. It's going to be Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Georgia. These states could really go either way, but I think that, and I'll just do this in order of the closest. I think that of these three states, one of these states sticks out to me as not as competitive as the others. I think that North Carolina is really close to being lean, and in fact, I was debating putting it in lean a few minutes ago, but I'll put it in tilt because I don't think that the Republicans win it by more than two. Plus, their leading candidate right now, Pat McCrory, is actually a pretty bad candidate. He lost the gubernatorial election in 2016. He's not very popular there, so he could make this race really, really competitive. Now, if they ran someone better like Mark Walker or something, they could probably win this race by 3 or 4. But as of right now, I don't feel comfortable putting it in anything other than the tilt Republican column. So yeah, North Carolina goes into Republican column. Now these last two seats are going to be really, really close, and one of them in particular. And I think the first seat, that gets called out of these two, is Georgia. I think that Georgia goes to Raphael Warnock, the Democratic incumbent, by around 1 or 2%, maybe a little less than the runoff. And with that, the Democrats would have their majority. 50 seats for them right now, and we haven't called Wisconsin yet, I guess, in this election night kind of thingy. But I think Georgia, we see Raphael Warnock, we see the way that he's been kind of bringing himself, kind of branding himself as a senator. He isn't branding himself as a moderate. He's branding himself as a trailblazing first black person to represent Georgia in the Senate Democrat. So I think that he gets really good base turnout, especially with Stacey Abrams probably being on the ticket alongside him as the gubernatorial nominee. So I think that he gets really good turnout from Atlanta, with Abrams being by his side. And I also think that the suburbs in Georgia are trending so far to the left that he doesn't really need to be a moderate or anything to beat whoever the Republicans run in this race, whether it be Vernon Jones, or not Vernon Jones, Herschel Walker, So Walker, again, is a good candidate. I think that, him being a black Republican gives him that talking point, kind of like Tim Scott, to, push conservative values to black voters who are usually a more Democratic voting bloc. So I think that he has quality as a candidate, but in a state like Georgia, I just don't see him pulling it off. He could, don't get me wrong, but he wouldn't be favored. So the last state that we have is Wisconsin, and this is, again, those of you who know me on Twitter or whatever, they know that this is my most controversial call, but I have Wisconsin going to the Democratic Party. I mean, we saw Democrats, like if Democrats can flip 2 runoff seats in January of just winning an election, at the presidential election, they can definitely win Wisconsin, where they need, Democrats, they have a majority, but it's not a very strong one, where if only one Democrat opposes something, it just goes down the drain. So Democrats need that extra seat or two, and I think they're going to be really energized to get it, especially in Wisconsin, where you have Ron Johnson kind of really branding himself as just a classical conservative, and that works great in a state like Alabama or Mississippi. But it doesn't work great in a state that Joe Biden won, and where if a Republican wins a statewide race there, they run as a populist. So I think that Johnson, being a populist, would certainly Johnson not being a populist would certainly not help him. Especially with working class voters who voted for Tammy Baldwin in the 2018 Senate election, who was a Democrat, and then voting for Trump in 2020. I think they transition over to the Democratic challenge of Sarah Godlewski. She did win a statewide race in 2018, and she won by around 4%. In the treasurer's race, so obviously you can't compare a local race like a treasurer's race to a Senate race, but I think that if voters elected her in 2018, I think she'd be favored to beat Johnson, who's a pretty bad incumbent for the GOP in 2022. So that's going to wrap up the Senate prediction. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy and found it informative, please leave that like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video.